Welcome to Episode 3, Our Early Campaigns. I'm Eric Lindstrom, Executive Director of Farm Animal Rights Movement. In this third episode of the series, covering our movement's earliest campaigns between 1975 and 1990, we'll start by covering the campaigns against seal clubbing and pirate whaling. Animal liberation author and renowned philosopher Peter Singer will follow with accounts of the campaigns to end cat blinding experiments and cosmetic testing on animals. PETA's Vice President Laboratory Investigations Cases Alka Chana and founder of Stop Animal Exploitation Now, Michael Budke, will cover several early anti-vivisection campaigns. Author of Animal Factories, Jim Mason will describe his book, which introduced farmed animals to our movement. And Alex Hershaft will close this episode with early campaigns of farm animal rights movement, including the Veal Ban campaign, World Day for Farmed Animals, and the Great American Meat Out. Our movement's most dramatic and celebrated early campaign in the mid-1970s was attempting to stop the annual slaughter of baby seals for their prized white fur in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The campaign was led by Fund for the Animals president Cleveland Amory. In 1976, Greenpeace board member Paul Watson intensified the campaign by leading a group of activists in spraying the seals with a harmless red dye, which rendered their pelts worthless. The following year, he was expelled from the Greenpeace board for physically disarming one of the sealers. That only provoked Paul to become more active. In 1977, he talked Cleveland Amory into buying him a ship that could actually sail into the Gulf of St. Lawrence and step up the defense of seals. This ship was named the Sea Shepherd and served as the launch pad for Paul's Sea Shepherd Conservation Society. In 1979, the Sea Shepherd, with Paul and Cleveland on board, sailed into the Atlantic to confront pirate whaling operations, which have continued for many years and many ships since then. The Sea Shepherd Conservation Society's anti-whaling operations were dramatized in the Animal Planet TV serial Whale Wars, which aired between 2008 and 2015.
Henry thought, well, let's really try to stop an experiment. So he used the Freedom of Information Act to find out what was going on in New York City, because that's where he lived. And quite amazingly, he discovered that just 6 blocks from where he lived, at the American Museum of Natural History, which is a museum that everybody in New York knows. If you want to see skeletons of dinosaurs, you go to the American Museum of Natural History. But what the millions of people who went to that museum had no idea about was that on the upper floors of that building, under the auspices of the American Museum of Natural History, scientists were doing really quite horrible experiments on cats. They were blinding them and they were removing their sense of smell, and they were seeing how this affected their sexual behavior. Henry and his small group started running a campaign which got quite a lot of publicity. They would stand outside the museum on the weekends, on busy days when people wanted to go, and they would hand out flyers about what's going on upstairs in the museum. So it's not like they were trying to cure cancer or any other major disease. It was purely trying to find out the way in which cats use different senses in order to behave sexually. The museum, I think, realized fairly soon that it was in some degree of trouble with this. And the campaign spread, got a lot of newspaper attention. Eventually, the National Institutes of Health, I think it was, who were funding the research with a research grant, decided that they were getting a lot of negative publicity for that, and the experiments ended. And that was the first time in the United States that animal protesters had stopped an actual experiment on animals. But the next thing he did was cosmetics testing on animals, which affects hundreds of thousands of animals, or did then, also in very painful ways. So, for example, one of the tests that Henry, again, got information on was a test called the Drey's test, which was done on rabbits who were put in kind of stocks so that just their head protruded. They were not anesthetized in any way. And then substances that might be used in cosmetics were put directly into their eye. There was a scale you could actually get from the Food and Drug Administration in the US, a scale as to what kind of eye damage, or what grade you should give to different kinds of eye damage. There were color photos of eyes of rabbits that were completely ulcerated and essentially destroyed. But the other important aspect about this campaign is that Henry was not saying to Revlon, you must stop testing on animals right now. He knew that that couldn't work because at that time the Food and Drug Administration was requiring animal tests in order to approve any new products. And you're not going to be able to get a major company to say, we won't put any new products on the market. So instead, Henry's strategy was to say, we want you to pledge to give a small percentage of your profits. It was a very small percentage. I don't remember exactly the figure, to develop an alternative to this test that doesn't use animals. And if you do that, we'll call off the campaign. And eventually, Revlon realized that the bad publicity was going to hurt them more than this very small percentage of their profits. So they agreed to that. And then Henry, of course, went from Revlon to Avon, the next biggest cosmetics company, and to a few others. And so he gathered a pool of funds, which was used to set up a Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing at Johns Hopkins University, a leading medical university in the United States. And that did eventually succeed. It produced an alternative so that the Dre's eye test is no longer a standard test, and many cosmetics, most of them now, can truthfully say on their products, not tested on animals.
Well, PETA started in 1980, and the case that initiated PETA was an undercover investigation at a place called the Institute for Behavioral Research, which was in Silver Spring, Maryland, in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And Alex Pacheco, who is one of PETA's co-founders, along with Ingrid Newkirk, he took a volunteer position at this facility and was horrified by what he saw, because there were monkeys kept in tiny, barren, bleak metal cages with a wire floor. That's where they lived. The experiments themselves were painful. The monkeys were put in devices where they were totally restrained, and there was no veterinary care for these animals. Some animals would die in the cages, and then these dead bodies would be put in freezers. Just horrific things. There was an amputated hand that was on the lead experimenter's desk that he used as an ashtray. PETA, through Alex Pacheco, took photographs, took video footage of what was going on in that facility, showed the absolute conditions of privation for these animals who were imprisoned in this place, and also took very diligent notes of what was happening. All of this evidence was taken to various experts, veterinarians, medical doctors, and others, to get scientific critiques of what was going on and the condition of the animals. And this information was shared with the media, was shared with members of Congress, people in prominent positions, and so on. This was the first time Americans were seeing what goes on with animals in laboratories. There was another investigation, and it was the Animal Liberation Front had gone into a laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania, and they took 70 hours of video footage that was shot by the animal experimenters themselves of a laboratory at UPenn where baboons were fitted with these cement helmets, and a hydraulic device was used to slam the baboons' heads into the cement helmet at a very high velocity, inducing brain damage. And the video footage is stunning. You see the animal experimenters in their white lab coats. They're smoking cigarettes while these baboons are tied to surgical tables. You see them making jokes about the condition of the baboons. One baboon who had sustained head injury, and it was sort of like what you imagine a stroke victim. Their limbs, that baboon could not use his limbs, and they were pulling up his arm, and it would drop back down, and they would make jokes about this. It was a real eye-opener. That video footage found its way to PETA's doorstep. PETA produced a 27-minute video, which people can watch on YouTube now, which was called Unnecessary Fuss. And it was given that name because the lead experimenter of that head injury laboratory said that he wasn't going to be responding to any of the claims being made about his laboratory because he didn't want to stir up all sorts of unnecessary fuss. But then when you watch the video, you see why such a fuss was being made about the rumors that were coming out of that laboratory. With the University of Pennsylvania head injury clinic with the baboons, PETA had brought that information to the National Institutes of Health, which was funding the experiments. And NIH at first was quite resistant to doing anything about those experiments, even though the public was up in arms, members of Congress were up in arms, but NIH resisted. And so PETA and other activists went to NIH. They staged a sit-in. It was a 4-day-long occupation of NIH offices, including the director of NIH's office. And after that, NIH relented. The laboratory was then shut down and was forced to return $1 million in public funding to the agency. So that was huge. I'll say that the Animal Liberation Front raids that took place in the 1980s and the early 1990s were critical as well. I think a lot of people are familiar with the case of Britches, who was a baby monkey at the University of California in Riverside. This was a baby monkey who was taken from his mother when he was born, when he was a newborn, and he had a sonar device that was attached to his head. His eyelids were sewn shut so that he wouldn't be able to see the world for the beginning of his life. When the ALF, the Animal Liberation Front, broke into the UC Riverside, they saw Britches and they rescued him. And they removed the sonar device. They had a veterinarian remove the stitches from his eyelids. Britches had developed tremors because of the conditions in which he was kept, the fact that he had been taken from his mother and just had a surrogate for comfort. And eventually he was placed with a real surrogate monkey mother at a sanctuary where people can go and see video footage online. And it's absolutely beautiful to see that this poor monkey, from whom everything had been taken and who was abused so horrifically, was actually able to have a happy life with this new surrogate mother, this foster mother. So these were all cases, and there were so many cases. Texas Tech, where there were cat experiments going on there, where devices were drilled into the skulls of cats who were then held in stereotaxic devices where their heads were kept stock still. There were experiments, sleep deprivation experiments involving cats, so many things, cruelties that we just cannot imagine. And were it not for the heroic and self-sacrificing work being done by the Animal Liberation Front, there's no way we would know that these things were going on.
And we ended up running a campaign to shut down a research project at the university which I had just graduated from. This was referred to as the cat crash experiment because it was a head injury research project being performed on cats. This experiment had been underway for a decade, had killed over 1,000 cats, used over $1 million in federal tax grants, and done nothing more than confirm information which had been known in the early 1900s. Eventually, we were successful in the local campaign that we ran in ending this research project. The climactic event of the campaign came when the University of Cincinnati had their homecoming day in 1988. We picketed the university that day, had dozens of activists on campus distributing an anti-cat crash brochure. I believe we distributed something like 2,500 of them that day. And then when all of the grads and the students got to the stadium for the football game, for the first hour of the game, a small plane towed a banner over the stadium that said, "Doctors oppose cat torture in UC labs." And it was about a month after that that the University of Cincinnati announced the end to this research project. And that was the first campaign and the first victory we had ever had.
Another impressive early anti-vivisection campaign was a series of massive protest rallies between 1982 and 1983 at the 4 U.S. primate centers, as well as in New York, Washington, D.C., and a dozen other cities around the world. The campaign was organized by Mobilization for Animals, MFA, led by a charismatic Ohio social worker named Richard Morgan.
My contribution would be mainly in the form of the book Animal Factories, which was co-authored with Peter Singer. It came out in 1980. It was the groundbreaker. No one in the animal groups had anything to do with farm animal issues and vegetarianism and veganism. It was all about cats and dogs and cruelty and hunting and trapping, but farm animals were off the table. So our book, I think, especially because of this shocking photographs, black and white photographs in the book, really exposed factory farming to the country. And the book made such a splash in 1980 that I appeared on NBC's morning talk show Today and showed pictures that are from the book. And it caused a bit of a stir. And that book, Animal Factories, with Peter Singer, was reviewed in major publications, leading newspapers, Washington Post. I had an op-ed piece in the New York Times. I did other morning talk shows in Cleveland, Chicago, a lot of radio programs. So it was noticed in 1980. And I think it was the groundbreaker. And I think what got it the most attention was the stark photographs, which is a whole story as to how we got those photographs. So I guess my major contribution was studying animal agriculture for years throughout the 1970s, reading farm industry magazines, learning the jargon, the industrial talk, rhetoric, and finding factory farms and getting invited to come see them and take photographs. Now, this was easily done in the 1970s because factory farming hadn't been exposed. And animal agriculture wasn't paranoid and alert and fearful of activism yet. So my photographer and I, Joe Keller, actually had access to these places. And we spent 2 months traveling around the country in a Chevy van, quite a bit of hardship involved in that. We lived on the road for 2 months and almost daily went and spent the day and hours in factory farms doing photography. The cliche is a picture is worth 1,000 words. I think if anyone saw the pictures in that book, they wouldn't have to read a word. They wouldn't need any explanation or footnotes or references. The pictures themselves are an indictment because they show animals in unspeakable conditions, which is modern farming, industrial farming, factory farming, we call it.
Although farmed animals account for 99% of animal abuse, for the first 2 decades, our movement was pretty much focused on vivisection, with some early attention to slaughter of baby seals and wearing of furs. The farmed animal issue was first introduced to the U.S. animal rights movement in 1980 by Jim Mason and Peter Singer with their revolutionary photo book, Animal Factories. The book featured scores of stark black and white photos of animals suffering in our nation's factory farms. My assisting Jim with editing the book was what turned me from a vegetarian advocate to a vegan animal rights activist, leading to founding the Farm Animal Rights Movement, or FARM, in 1981. FARM remained the sole organization fighting for farmed animals' liberation until Henry Spira joined us with his coalition to abolish factory farming in 1985. Then Karen Davis joined the struggle with her United Poultry Concerns in 1990. We began by looking for a way to represent farm animals as suffering living beings that people could relate to, rather than just food on the hoof. The dairy calves chained in their crates in Jim's photograph looked a lot like large dogs chained in someone's backyard. In 1982, our veal-ban campaign became America's first farmed animal campaign. It included picketing of French and Italian restaurants, me and the fellow activists doing hunger strikes in real veal crates in front of the White House, and lots of congressional testimony. It led eventually to a broad ban on chaining the calves in crates and a drastic reduction in veal consumption. The following year, we launched World Day for Farmed Animals to mourn and memorialize the tens of billions of animals abused and slaughtered for food each year. The date selected was October 2nd, the birth date of the great vegetarian and champion of nonviolence, Mahatma Gandhi. Each year since then, we have encouraged animal activists to commemorate the occasion by fasting, posting on social media, and conducting vigils, tabling, leafleting, and mock funerals. 24 mayors and governors have proclaimed World Day for Farm Animals in their jurisdictions. In 1985, we launched a Great Meat Out, a worldwide occasion to celebrate and encourage transition to plant-based eating. The date selected was March 20th, first day of spring, symbolic of renewal and rebirth. Worldwide activities have included information tables, exhibits, food sampling, cooking demonstrations, and festivals. For 12 years, we treated congressional staffers to a plant-based lunch. Dozens of governors and mayors have issued Meat Out proclamations in their jurisdictions. We followed up with 12 visits to slaughterhouses in Virginia, Maryland, and California, where we staged all-night vigils and attempted to stop trucks carrying animals to their deaths in the morning. We also blocked the entrance to the U.S. Department of Agriculture's building in D.C. and staged a sit-in in the Secretary of Agriculture's office in our struggle to alleviate the plight of farmed animals.
Thank you for watching episode 3 of 5 Decades, 1 Mission, where we reported on our movement's early campaigns. We invite you to watch episode 4, which addresses the various ways our movement has rallied and consolidated through the years. We welcome your comments on the 5 Decades, 1 Mission video series. Please email us at info@farmusa.org.